Let's get participants on. I'm going to introduce the meeting, and the first item to have just a couple things to say about our main event. And then because Vicki is in Mexico, I asked Susan if she would lead the meeting from the room, lead the discussion from the room, because I don't think my sore throat's going to hold out. So with all that, welcome everybody to a regularly scheduled meeting of the Zoning and Planning Committee on Monday, February 27th. At the beginning of the meeting on the committee, we have Vicki Danberg, Vice Chair of the committee, coming in from Mexico. We have a counselor from at large from Ward 6. We have Josh Krinsman on Zoom at large from Ward 4, I'm sorry. We have President Susan Albright at large from Ward 2. Let's see if I can go around the table. I can't see you all. So we have, I'm going to have to get to a different view. There we go. And we have Councilor Pam Wright at large from Ward 3, and we have Councilor Holly Ryan, Ward Councilor from Ward 8, and Councilor Allison Leary at large from Ward 1. And we have staff here tonight, steadfast and true, Jen Kyra, Deputy Director of the Planning Department, and a very special guest who is going to now stay with us for the duration. You might remember Zachary Lamel, who's been away for a good period of time, and I hope enjoying himself and their new little girl. So before I introduce Mr. Love to get to the main event, we have a brief item. Are we joined this evening, and Jacqueline Norton is our clerk. I can't see her, but I know she's in the back of the room. Item 46-23 is the appointment of Anne Marie Stein to the Newton Historical Commission. Is she with us?
Yes, I am. Here I am.
Online?
Yes.
Great. Okay, good. As I understand it, you were with us not very long ago when we happily appointed you to an alternate position on the NDC. And this is to, the mayor wants to make you a full member of the Newton Historic Commission for a term of office to expire March 6, 2026. So we hope your experience on the commission has been enlightening and interesting. Would you like to say a few words before we move the item?
Sure. I've been, is it almost a year now? It seems like it's gone very fast. Anyway, I think the work that the Historical Commission is doing is very important. It actually provides a venue where a lot of items get discussed. I think it really also intersects a lot with questions of zoning. So, it's become very apparent the things that need to be addressed in zoning that the Historical Commission can't. But it has been a very interesting and it's always a very community-based discussion and very valuable.
Well, thank you. Do we have comments from any members of the committee? I see Councilor Danberg.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you very much. I have agreed to carry on with and Marie in 6 on Medic. I will move her approval.
Okay. Councilor Danberg, I don't know if you can hold on to your video and your audio tonight, because we got the gist of it. I think it was a positive statement, and you want to move approval.
Thank you.
So we have a motion to approve. Any other commentators? Seeing none, all in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Any abstentions? Thank you so much for joining us. I don't know if you want to stick with us tonight, where we will actually be talking for a period of time, not right away, but for a period of time about prioritizing historic preservation in the zoning. So up to you. Could probably have dinner first and come back.
And that, I might do that. That would be great. Do you have an idea about when that might be?
I don't, I would be remiss to wager that. We're gonna talk about design standards first. I never know for sure where the conversation is gonna go.
Great. Well, maybe I'll just stop the video and I'll listen in. Thank
Okay.
you.
All right, thank you. All right, so the next item is our usual 38-22 regarding village center zoning. But what we're focusing on tonight are the materials presented in the 22-page memo in the packet. I believe that's the right number. So what Ms. Kyra primarily has done, working with UTIL, I believe, correct me at any moment, is to, similar to what we did last June, to take apart the framework and then look at the individual elements of it, and then consider each of those elements, take some straw votes, figure out where the committee was generally headed. This memo begins to do the same thing. There were several items not fleshed out yet that will be coming in March, but there's a lot of material in there, particularly about, as we said last time we met, we were going to dig into design standards and how they manifest. We're going to then go into priority streets. You saw a bunch of maps in the packet, and I need to say this. I got contacted by one constituent who tends to dig really deep into our materials, who was concerned that people might think that those maps are the version 2 maps. They're labeled properly, but just to make it clear to everyone who's watching, these are not the version 2 maps. These are the version 1 maps with a proposal to us for what streets we want to make sure we where we want to make sure we get retail and restaurants, active uses on the ground floor. So I wanted to say that. Then key elements of adaptive reuse is where we talk about prioritizing historic preservation. And I don't know if there's going to be time to go beyond that, but there's also material in the packet about parking standards, an MAPC study. So I know you all have seen this and read through the materials, but on the committee, but I just want to make sure that everybody watching knows what the focus is tonight. So with that, I'm going to be dark and quiet and listen. Unless I'm burning to say something, I'm going to hand leading the discussion over to President Albright. And thank you so much for doing that for me tonight.
Okay, no problem. Hope you feel better. And we should just say that we've been joined by Councilor Baker from Ward 7.
And I just want to say something as a process matter. I very much appreciate having all these documents. So,
All right. So Ms. Kyra, I leave it to you. Who's leading?
I'll kick things off and then I'll hand it off to Mr. Love here.
Are we gonna ask questions as we go along or after each section, or how do you want it?
I think what probably makes the most sense is after each section. So it's pretty brief here, we'll give a sort of introduction, talk about what we're thinking, and then open it up for questions and discussion before we move to the next topic. So as Chair Crossley said, you can go to the next one, Jacqueline. We put together a framework similar to what this committee reviewed last summer as a way of organizing ourselves moving into a second version of the ordinance text and the maps. So these are the topics that have been bubbling up that we've said we're working on, that we've been thinking about changes. And so we just wanted to put together something saying, okay, these are the changes we're recommending prior to releasing a second draft. So we haven't made any updates to the text or the maps at this time. This is just to discuss these main topics. You can go to the next one, Declan. Thank you. So this framework includes 9 items. So in the packet Friday, we had some details on the first 6. we're, wrapping up some analysis on the last three. And then we'll have that sort of second part for everyone in March. And so we can kind of work our way through these first 6 for now. And what we have is focusing on design standards, identifying mixed-use priority streets, prioritizing historic preservation, reducing residential parking requirements, eliminating the special permit allowance for additional height or footprint, coming up with a consistent policy for how city-owned parcels are zoned. And then the remaining 3 that we're still working through are revisions to VC1, incentivizing additional affordable housing, and maximizing our compliance with MBTA communities. So we anticipate working through all of these tonight, as well as through the March meetings.
I just have a clarifying question. When you talk about VC1, for instance, and there are some recommendations about some of the applied to the existing maps, but not the new maps. When did the new maps show up?
So we're hoping to have the new text and maps probably April. So we want to work through these concepts first with the committee, and then issue updated maps and text.
Okay.
Yeah, because the maps will probably come with the text, and some of this depends on, these discussions here. So we're really rethinking VC1 and what we're analyzing there, and what we end up proposing, and the feedback will likely guide the revisions to the mapping as well. And so I'm going to hand it off to Tim Love to talk through the design standards.
Yeah, we didn't know exactly how to address this. You'll remember at the last ZAP meeting, your packet included the original version 1.0 with all the design standards highlighted. I think some people didn't have color copies and maybe couldn't see that, but it might be a useful reference too. What we decided to do was to pull those apart into lists based on 3 design categories. I think first of all, the zoning that we're proposing is fundamentally a zoning that's based on design standards. So almost the entire code includes a recipe of standards that, when combined and applied together, limits to a great deal what's possible and not possible in terms of design choices that an architect can make. We thought it would be useful to include the design standards that are in the code itself, not separate guidelines, in 3 categories. One is those standards that help to shape the building form. Those standards that have to do with where that building form can go on the site. And lastly, standards that are in the zoning that affect the design of the site. A lot of that's focused on service areas, parking lots, their design, curb cuts, how parking is handled. And rather than include all of the dimensional detail, we've just provided them in categories. And so in the zoning, the primary determinant of the form of buildings is the maximum footprint. And the building height really fundamentally explained by numbers of floors. But there's a footnote that there are maximum height limits for mixed-use residential versus commercial buildings. But really the way that your neighbors, your constituents, architects, developers are meant to start with the code is say, okay, I can have a 15,000 square foot building, ground floor footprint, and I can have 4.5 stories and nothing more than that. And that's a clear way for people to get into and understand what's possible. Then the next ingredient is that half floor height. And decisions that are made about whether you do a flat roof penthouse, set 7 feet back, or you do some kind of roof pitch within a range. So that's, I would say, once you get the number of floors and the footprint, that's your next choice. There are then criteria in the zoning about how you think about windows in the building mass. And so there are rules about how much of the front elevation has to have a certain percentage of fenestration. There are rules about the front elevation and its relationship to the frontage. Those are all things that have to do with how the building meets the ground and the amount of windows to get a kind of attractive facade. There are then rules about how long the facade, even with the footprint maximums, there are rules in the facade about how long the facade can be before you have to have a change in plane to make a, let's say, a single facade look like two buildings. There are then rules about how you can apply awnings, canopies, bays, and balconies. Those are controlled by dimensional standards too, kind of maximum sizes, how you can apply them. Building entrances are also established in the zoning, how often, their location, their articulation. Already talked about roof features, and then rules about screening mechanical equipment on the roof. So if you think about all of those things as the recipe of components that an architect thinks about, those work together to shape what's possible and not with a building to a higher level of detail than your current zoning. Okay. Then how a building is placed on a lot. It's not too much different from conventional zoning. Setbacks from the front, side, and rear. You can have multiple buildings within our zoning code for very large sites versus giant buildings. And so we have rules about how far apart two buildings or more can be on a site itself. And then we have a rule that we've talked about a couple of times, that if the existing sidewalk isn't 12 feet wide, you have to include on the private property space for the expansion of the sidewalk to make it 12 feet wide. And we also have rules to encourage buildings facing sidewalks about the percentage of frontage that should face the address of the building, while allowing enough space for driveways to get to the back for parking or that kind of thing. In terms of the site standards, for lots that are bigger than 30,000 square feet, we have an open space requirement that is within the special permit territory, but we've discussed a couple of times in our discussions here that thinking about open space needs to be negotiated, not required, because it's very difficult to know on smaller sites where the open space should go. There's rules about parking placement, setbacks, how access works, curb cuts, their size, their placement, relationship to the frontage. There are requirements for surface parking lot design in terms of landscape buffers, their dimensions, screening requirements, and then how loading's handled. So those things all together dictate a lot of what's possible and not possible from a design standpoint through the zoning itself, which is important, especially for a zoning code that is going to allow projects as of right below 30,000 on lots that are below 30,000 square feet. Now, and so this is just a list. So these are the kind of categories pulled out of the zoning, and they're in a slightly different organizational structure than the way the zoning's been laid out by the planning department, just so the categories are clear. Next slide.
Can we talk about that previous slide if we have questions?
Well, I just want to just two slides for this topic.
Okay.
And so at the last ZAP meeting, we took a couple of potential lots that might be redeveloped, and we took the design standards and the zoning out for a test drive to see how those rules would be applied. And so I'm just reminding you, in your packet from last time, the slide presentation from last time, we looked at a couple of streets I believe this is Lincoln Street. And we applied the zoning, the percentage of fenestration, the rules that allow for bay windows, the required floor-to-floor height for the ground floor, the range of roof pitches that are allowed. We played the dormer game, which is also part of the kit of parts in the zoning, to in a way demonstrate that the wide range of design standards in the zoning add up to a design framework within the zoning itself. It's important that design standards in zoning documents are non-discretionary. So they all have precise dimensional rules, mins, maxes, and that means that in an as of right regime for lots that are under 30,000 square feet, that there's no discretionary decisions about the zoning being followed or not. We also think that the number of standards we have is enough to control the quality of design, but not so much that the people that are going to be reviewing and enforcing projects think there's so much to review that it requires, more complicated review. And that is a little bit of a lesson learned looking at some other zoning codes that maybe are too complicated with the number of design standards. So we think this is a reasonable amount of standards with an initial concept design being presented to the city, requiring those teams to actually qualify in their submission how they're meeting the standards, and it's user-friendly for development teams too. So I think that's enough about the design standards. And again, if you want to know how that, if you go back to slides, I think Councilor Wright's going to ask about it. Those are these things that were highlighted in this document, pulled out and reorganized into what we thought was a slightly clear taxonomy or structure.
So Councilor Wright and Councilor Baker, and can you make it so that I can see others? Thank you.
First on this slide, I have a few questions. I'm not as familiar with glazing standards. Can you just explain it a little more and the different numbers and what that means?
Yeah, I typically, and this is an issue we're going to be talking about when we talk about those the street we might want to privilege requiring ground floor commercial. Typically, you set a minimum percentage of fenestration within the zoning code to make sure you don't get windows that are too small and mean looking, and or on the ground floor you get enough glazing for shop fronts. And so we tend to, in the zoning like this that we write, include those two percentages as part of the zoning code.
So like, I'm thinking of CVS in both Newtonville and West Newton, they probably don't comply with this. I mean, because you can't see into the store. They have windows, but you can't see.
You can. I have had words with them and you can.
You
And
can't.
it's,
Now you can.
and Newtonville, you can.
It's,
Okay.
and it's possible. So I, in a previous job, oversaw a design, a district that had strong design standards. And we had minimal visible light transmittance and light reflectance and minimum transparency requirements. We had a Rite Aid that said they couldn't meet that. They had their typical convenience store model. They had the shelves backed up against the windows. They had looking into the registers from the windows, blacked out all the windows. It took a bit of time, but absolutely could meet it. And the store looked so much better once they did meet the standards and had that transparency. And it's not always the typical store model when it's a large national chain, but it can be done when there are requirements.
So on building entrances, you talk about the number. So how is the number going to be controlled?
Well, it typically has to do with requiring the main entrances to buildings to be on the frontage, facing the street or the sidewalk, and not allowing other decisions where the entrances are around on the side. And are we requiring,
So we require that the main entrance be from the public right of way on that street. Multi-story buildings with ground story active use spaces must have one principal entrance for each active use space, in addition to a principal entrance necessary for any upper stories.
And then I think there's also some, if it's all residential, there needs to be so many on the ground floor.
I think we had that in the first draft, but
we took it out.
yeah, and I think, yeah, had some concerns ultimately with that language, heard some feedback that that's not always feasible.
Okay, the next thing, mechanical equipment. So we have a maximum height. Are we gonna do a maximum height with mechanical equipment?
So we have it set up now, similar to our existing zoning. So the only place where we have a maximum height with mechanical equipment is portions of Riverside of the zoning created for that. Generally, there's just certain things that are exempt from that height. So we have structured this to essentially match our existing zoning, except we required that the equipment be screened and set back at least 10 feet from the building wall.
And that 10 feet is from the floor that it's above, so.
Yeah.
Some of
Yeah,
them
so
are.
the
gonna
building
be
wall,
seven,
yeah.
Yep.
So it
Okay,
would be additional 10 feet beyond the 7 if that was the choice somebody made about on the floor.
so in building placement, so we talk about the sidewalk width is a 12 feet minimum.
Right.
That includes a berm, yes or no? So if you have a berm, then, because you get the sidewalk and you got trees, you know, cut out for trees, so where is that 12 feet?
Oh, it includes,
have it.
the 12 feet does include that zone typically near the curb that includes the tree grates, you know, fire hydrants, it's called the furnishing zone sometimes. The 12 feet would be inclusive of that.
Okay, so it's for most village centers will be from the curb would be where the 12 feet starts. I can't think of any other ones that had more area. Can we go to the next picture? I just want to get so the second building on the left there, the one farther away, so that needs 12 feet from the curb. And then the closest building, it's set back, and if you take a look at the windows there and that, so it looks like it's set back another 12 feet. So it's really 24 feet from the curb.
Well, there's a setback range that the developer could choose.
Yeah,
And
but I mean,
so-
in this picture though, is that correct roughly what that is then? It's about 24 feet?
No, I think it's 12 to the part of the, Lauren made the model, so maybe she can answer, she's on Zoom, but it's 12 feet to the face of from the curb to the face of the building that's closest to the sidewalk. And there's a little bit more setback, but not 12 feet to allow for outdoor seating. That's why those planters
Oh,
are there.
because I'm looking at the windows and you got some area on each side of the windows, maybe it's 10 feet, not 12 feet.
Yeah.
Okay, so about 22 feet or so from the curb.
Lauren, are you, if you
I
were,
am, yep. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to answer that. It's, I set back an additional 7 feet, I want to say. So that's really getting you to a total of 19 to 20 feet from the curb.
Okay, it's just surprising that's 7 feet. Okay, thank you.
Councilor Baker.
So again, this goes to a sort of a broader framework question, which is, there are some things that currently are in as of right in our zoning, and then other things are dealt with special permit. And we also have site plan review, which is a separate cluster of stuff that the planning department and the council have to pass on in special permits. What you described is a menu, sort of as I read it, where you say, okay, if you're gonna get a building, you've got to go, you know, you have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, then you've got.
well, they all have to apply. It's,
All have to apply.
you can eat everything.
You have to eat everything.
Right.
What I'm curious about is, I think it will be helpful to not only us, but our colleagues in the public. When you, all of this comes together to say, here are things that you've seen before, the numbers are maybe different or not. Here's some things you haven't seen before, and these are new ideas, and these have these numbers, because I think part of, again, the challenge of looking at what's old and what's proposed is going to be to understand the distinction. And then the other thing that occurs to me is whether you said this is a sort of a category of, categories, that's not the way the ordinance is set out. But have you been in a situation where something like this is actually a clear way to build the ordinance?
Oh, the whole ordinance?
No, well, at least this,
The structure.
yeah,
I think the current plan is to have this be an overlay. To not infiltrate and infect the entire ordinance. But the city could choose, I don't think not now, because we'll never get anywhere with anything. After this is operational for a while, to say, oh, this is pretty good, we might think about restructuring the full ordinance with this kind of logic.
yeah, I wasn't asking you to go that far. I was just trying to understand whether this is how,
Like these sort of.
Oh, to have it organized this way.
yeah, this chunk.
Well, I think we do to a certain extent, as you move through this document, the design standards. We have our lot design standards, which I would say are kind of,
Building placement.
you know, and then
And
we
site
have our
standards.
building design standards. Which are gonna be your shaping the building piece. And then I think we have it is split that way, and we have site standards.
Yeah.
I think graphically and organizationally, we can always do better, and there's a lot of newer codes that are doing a lot of work to make it very user friendly. You know, if this, then that, and move through, so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I suspect we'll create some, you know, if this is adopted, create some implementation guides too, right? For the public, for city staff, checklists, those sorts of things that may break things down in a simpler way. Make sure it's clear.
Again, this is not,
Yeah.
go to the content, it's just how it's designed.
Yeah, I'm just curious for the Councilor Baker, did you find that at least the structure of this was relatively easy to follow?
I did, and the only question I guess I was trying to figure out whether if I were a developer or builder, I would enter at the left or enter on the right. You started with the building envelope. and-
Right.
And I might say, well, wait a minute, let me look at the site first and then figure out where. But that's a, you know, it may be worth consulting with your design professionals and say, what do you read first,
Right.
second, and third? But that's beyond the scope of the full conversation tonight.
Okay, Council Leary.
Thank you. I thought that I really liked reading through this. I thought it was really clear, and I love the idea of all these menu of things to work with. So that we really can better shape and have a better idea of what these buildings will look like. I was wondering, Mr. Love, if there were other communities that are using these same standards that are in place. So if we want to do a field trip or something and take a look, could we get a better idea of what the built environment would actually look like?
Well, we just wrapped up, it was just approved by the planning board in the town of Barnstable, the new zoning code for Hyannis, which is not just the Main Street area, but it's like a big village center that was just approved. I know that there are 2 projects that were making their way through the permitting process that use the new framework, even though it wasn't in place yet. The best local example is the city of Somerville. There's quite a few projects that are in the pipeline, some that are even finished. I think the issue with the Somerville code is that the design standards are very detailed and very granular to a level of detail that I think the city staff would say it's difficult to enforce because the number of standards drills into a level of detail that means that any code reviewer has to make sure that even features of a feature meet the requirements. And so we've taken a couple of projects through the Somerville code, and this in a way is a reaction to that. How does that sound? It's based on design standards and making the predictability of the final design outcome more predictable through the code itself, but it doesn't drill into a level of detail that just makes it more difficult to enforce. And I don't know if Jen or Zach, you want to make any comments about that?
We looked at years ago when we were first really, kicking off the zoning redesign, we looked at a number of codes, and I remember one was for Hartford. And it was similar. It went into the width of shutters, based on the width of the window outside of a historic district or anything like that. So it's so many fine grained details that aren't as impactful. I think what we tried to do here is pull out those that are most impactful, the ones that we tend to focus on during the special permit process that really contribute to the life of the street and regulating the form without getting into the nitty gritty that's.
And I would probably just say, to me, this is going back to how development happened, 100 years ago. So if you go to older places, you had individual smaller property owners build a building, and the various features, if you kind of break it down mathematically, we kind of get to a lot of these things here. And we've tried to do it, as I think as Tim was saying, is to allow for design creativity, allow for innovation and all these various things. But I think if you go to these older places here, Europe, I know Tim in the last meeting you mentioned the Alan Jacobs Great Streets book, that places that they analyze are not happening because of zoning, they happen over time, and we're trying to pull out what makes sense and then allow the designers and the owners to do on top of that.
People like those older buildings and designs. And one other thing, one of the great features of those is diversity of building types. And so how can we ensure there would be some diversity of building types and that not everyone is going to go with the same look?
Well, I think the real tool here is for DC2 and DC3 establishing a maximum footprint, and that is going to limit the ability for, especially on bigger sites, developers and their teams to do oversized buildings. Interestingly, 28 Austin Street, in terms of the footprint, is even too big for our proposed maximum footprint for the DC3. And so, and in fact, when we were setting that maximum footprint and we were looking at some newer projects in the pipeline and looking at existing projects, that's a very successful building, but partly because you don't see that L that runs in the back, that if that was along the street would make the building, quite frankly, look a little bit too big. So I think the maximum footprint and the requirement then, if you have a bigger site, you have to put two buildings on a site, is going to keep a lot of that from happening. And I think the developers and architects in Newton recently have been responsible about that. I mean, the scale of the trio is broken down so that even though I guess it's two buildings, it looks like more buildings. And so the maximum facade length, so we have the maximum footprint, and then we have a maximum footprint also built into the code. And that in a way through the zoning forces the scale of the buildings to be broken down into even a smaller scale.
Okay, thank you. Just regarding fenestration, the Walgreens in corner, and also the one on Four Corners, both have the blocked windows.
Go speak to them.
Will they change it? Because it's such, another thing that makes such a huge difference. The fenestration being able that's so
huge.
critical.
And it's written into MU4 now.
Yeah.
So Trio and Austin Street were required to have a certain percentage be transparent.
And so that CVS had to comply with that too when they moved into that building, right? Because they always have that model of the glazed windows and they have pictures on them and stuff. Yeah. So that will all change. That won't be allowed anymore.
That's right.
And-
You can cover some, but you have to meet that minimum percentage.
Thank you.
I'm gonna come. Councilor Lane.
Yeah, I'm just gonna. So I really like this, but it's really easy to understand. I know it's the same information pretty much as the last handout, but I like the way this is done. So when you were doing this, you mentioned that I think it was Somerville's. I call it nitpicking, but too many, requirements and standards, and I like to have the standards if it's by right. So when you did that and we're looking at this now, so do you take in account inspectional services? Is that what you did with this? Or?
We've had one discussion with them at some point, didn't we? Am I
We-
having a?
I think you have, we've had many discussions with them. Yeah, that's always something we're thinking about. And, we've all been over there and at the counter and the constant questions and all the permits that are coming through there and see that things have to be pretty clear and quantifiable. For this, we still have to work through exactly how the implementation will go, but this would be a significant change going from going to by right for many of these projects and incorporating these design standards. So I think it would be working collaboratively between planning and inspectional services, because we're checking all these things as part of the special permit process now when they come in for a building permit and checking for the plans. So I think it would be planning, doing a similar thing, just, being a step in the building permit process for by right projects and checking off a lot of these design standards.
Yeah, because I worry about that, because we seem to have trouble keeping up with everything right now on inspection.
Yeah, no, we don't want to add a big burden to inspectional services. And this is something we do now already as part of the special permit process. So it would be easy for planning to verify it as part of the building permit.
Yeah, I would like to see that if there's any way we can figure that out.
Oh, it's really easy, especially with our new gov system. We put GIS flags in these properties and then it triggers an automatic requirement in the building permit workflow.
Okay, and the other question, along the lines of what Council Wright was asking, just so I understand, so the equipment on the roofs, so it would be on the half story and set back 10.
Yeah.
And
From all sides.
okay, and there would be any requirement on the height of the equipment itself?
I mean, it's a good question. It's not really an issue with residential projects because it's condensers and things, but we might think about that for commercial projects. I mean, it's a much bigger challenge in I don't think it's a risk in village centers because of the footprint maximum. But if we didn't have a footprint maximum and somebody wanted to build a lab building here, in the village centers, then those mechanical enclosures are 25, 30 feet high.
Right, that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah, and we can maybe be more specific so that those aren't included, or look at how we're handling those now.
Does the existing zoning handle that?
I think, I'm not sure, so we can take a look and see how it's being handled now, and because the intent is not to allow those big lab penthouses. I don't think we're gonna get lab in village centers anyway, because Tim was saying, you can't.
Well, I'm just,
get the big order.
and then it'll be screened too, right?
Yeah, there's a requirement for screen.
We did deal with that over at Riverside.
Yeah.
Not the original building there.
Yeah,
About the neighbors worried about the mechanical and besides the noise, what they were looking at, the screening, and it was science, labs, so. All right, that's all.
Do you have a point on just on the labs? We're actually dealing with a problem on the Watertown side. And it's all residential on the Newton side. So Watertown has put in big labs with, and there's a lot of noise complaints. It's been months of it. And we're actually going on site to meet with Representative Lawn and one of the city councilors from Watertown to talk about that. And there's a proposal for lab space on California Street. So I think I'd like to really start talking about that issue. This isn't the venue for it, but I think it's a real concern because as we get more and more labs, the one on Galen Street is huge and it's right across from residential. I don't know how Watertown gets away with that, because that's the one thing our special permit process is really good about. We don't subject our residents to that kind of stuff, but the other towns certainly do. And of course, Ward 1 is surrounded by Watertown and Brighton, and that's so we see that. But I just want to raise that because they're coming closer and closer, and we're already getting complaints from across the river. And noise, as you know, is such a detriment in terms of quality of life. It impacts on wildlife too, and that's a wildlife corridor right there. So I did want to talk about that at some other time.
For California Street, that's definitely something we need to consider.
Okay, thank you.
And just to set some context, the maximum footprint in DC 3 is 15,000 square feet. And none of the labs that are getting permitted now are smaller than 25,000 square feet. So this is a no lab
Okay.
zoning code that we're proposing here, but I agree with you about California Street.
California Street might be smaller than that though. It's lab, I think they're lab spaces that they would rent out.
Oh, yeah, you're talking about the one that's being proposed.
Yes,
But
that's
yes.
not a big one.
Yeah, for our,
Yeah.
Counselor Wright.
Kind of following up on a few of these things. In Somerville, are they going to go back and simplify their?
I don't think so. I think what's happened is that the code's been operational for about 18 months. And ISD is slowly getting up to speed about how to review projects. And so I think related to some other comments, there was a big ISD learning curve. And more now, they're taking over the interpretation from the planning department. For a while, the planning department had to step in and help ISD interpret the code, but I think it's becoming systematized now. The full bureaucracy now is developing a kind of body of knowledge, and I think that that's a kind of earned knowledge they're not going to go back on.
Okay. Could you possibly forward us the where it's located? That I'd just like to read it.
The Somerville code?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good idea. So just have that around.
Read the Somerville Code, that'll put us to sleep at night.
I read it about 4 years ago, so it's been a while. And it was before it was approved. Zach needs to read it. To put him straight.
Ray needs to read it.
If you look at it, we can promise you that what we're proposing won't be as long as that.
550 pages.
Right.
I think, I don't want to put words into people's mouth. One of the things that someone has asked me is, these design standards, and I think it's great to have design standards. But it kind of looks like, oh, this is all new, but some of it's not new. Some of it's what we're doing now, or it might be a slight change or whatever. Is there any way to make a note what's additional versus what's a modification of something that we have now versus that's what we have now?
Right.
Yeah, and some of this, it varies, right? So our business zones have very, very little of this. So the existing zoning for village centers, they have setbacks and height. That might be it. And then MU4, was a step forward in that and includes some of these things. We're now taking that and building upon it further. So we don't have zoning that in place that has all of this, but the MU4 does have some of this. It has, some of the ground floor transparency requirements and building entrances.
So is MU4 still available once we have this zone? So you can do the present zone like it's BU1 or BU2. Can they go for a special permit for MU4 and then, or they could do the overlay in by right?
So, that's partially going to be up to the council, right? So we've talked with the law department about what it would mean to remove MU4 from the ordinance at the time that we adopt this, because MU4 was meant for village centers. We think this is a new and improved version for village centers. We wouldn't really want to see projects come in under MU4. The complication is we will likely have some projects still out there that had approval under MU4, but haven't gotten a building permit to sort of exercise that yet. So it likely will need to stay on the books, at least for a while, potentially could be removed in the future. I would say from our end, as far as messaging, we would very strongly discourage any submittals for rezoning to MU4 or rezoning in general in the village centers if this is adopted. Ultimately, that's up to the council whether to approve or deny that. But you know, we would certainly discourage that.
Okay. In our discussion tonight, I thought I heard there's a maximum facade length. I thought there isn't a maximum, but at 100 feet, you have to transition.
Exactly.
So there's not a
That's what we did
maximum
yeah.
Right.
facade length, but there you need a transition space. Okay, I think that's it for right now.
Council Baker.
So, one of the things I'm curious about in sort of again, learning from our experience, it sounds like you went back and looked at Austin Street and a variety of the projects. And so part of what, at least I understood the intent, was to say, what are elements that have been part of special permit applications that we can abstract out of those solutions and say, what do we codify in effect, right?
Right. That's right.
There are a couple of things that aren't here that I'm curious about. One is shadows. And I didn't know if there's a design standard that specifically relates to shading and how much of it, but that's been an issue that's come up in the conversation about the height of buildings and what they do to the streetscape. So I think it would be worth thinking about that dimension. We have a lighting standard, but it's part of a separate section of the ordinance. But it does seem to me that there's some cross-referencing in here that you may want to you do anyway, but I think it's worth saying. We have some fence rules, we have some lighting rules now. Some of them don't necessarily apply in this context in the same way, but we've tried very much historically to protect the residences from the adverse impacts of properties next door. And so it may be worth spending a little time between now and when you come back to us, just thinking about this. And are there any other kind of design standard? That's not the guidelines, but the standards section that ought to be there. The other dimension that I don't see, and again, I'm not sure whether it ought to be there, but I'm just asking, are colored materials. Because I know those come up in historic districts a lot. Now this is a different situation, but you are trying to go not just for a minimum level of quality, but saying, okay, there's some stuff that we think is better. So for an example, I know in the Chestnut Hill district, stucco is not an approved building service because of the nature of how it works out in that context. And now there are other places where it might. I'm just using that as an example.
I think minimum, building cladding standards is something that we could certainly consider. No UFIS, no stuff. I think that's something. Again, we need to make it non-discretionary. So it's.
I understand, and that's.
But there are some things I think that we could also consider putting in the zoning. I think it's a good idea.
I'm not sure I've exhausted the categories, but I'm trying to think about what's not on this page. That everybody looks at the building and comes up and says, oh goodness, what happened here? And we said, well, we didn't recognize that, and you want to try and anticipate that, I think.
Yeah, and we want balance. We don't want to go, it's not a local historic district.
No, I understand.
And
Just,
we don't typically regulate color or architectural style. I think Tim's right, a certain quality of material, maybe something we want to include. But the special permits today typically are not requiring certain colors or materials. You may have some things shown on plans, but oftentimes it's still mostly about the general form and massing.
Chestnut Hill is a little unusual because we do have color.
I mean, that's a historic
Yeah,
district, so
historic.
those operate very differently.
You might say, for example, I'm not sure you want Pepto-Bismol pink building in your village center, even though it's commercial. I mean, you might just say there's certain color ranges that are not possible.
Well, a lot of municipalities have a,
No disrespect to Pepto Bismol, by the way.
it can be very useful at times, but I think, we can have, we can disallow EFS, which is stucco, or only allow it on certain facades. We can,
Again, this is a judgment call that you're gonna, but I'm just asking you to think about
Yeah.
it before you.
I think it's an excellent point.
Okay, we have a few people online, and Counselor Downs.
Hi, thank you. Fascinating discussion. I'm really encouraged that that you're thinking along the lines of the Somerville ordinance. I was there recently because we unfortunately had some body work to do on Webster Auto Body. And there were two buildings and a new one going up as well, but two newer buildings that both looked both multifamily, both against the train track, both looked fantastic and looked also like they were providing residents with some real amenities that were sheltered from both the street and the railroad. So this is this is great. Would be great to have that level of, or at least some level of design controls in Newton for that kind of thing.
Counselor
Can
Downs,
you-
1 second.
We were just having an alarm that was tripping through here. And the war memorial doors, they are both open. We just wanted to make sure everything was okay tonight. Nothing. out of
Everything's
the
fine in here.
And I'm always happy to see the police are on top of things. That's that helps in my other job too. Then I have two questions. As far as shadows on our streetscapes, I wonder, given the heat islands and other discussions we've had around climate change, whether shadows might not be a benefit, not just a detriment to our streetscapes. And also would love to hear a discussion about street furniture or green strips, particularly in village centers, and whether there's an argument, what are the arguments for having that or not having that? We just returned from a trip where I did a lot of observations of different city structures and street structures, and was impressed at how walkable some very narrow streets with shadows and very little street furniture just really were, as long as you also had plazas or some other place that they opened up into. So I'd love to hear more about that and hear more thinking about those two things, shadows and the street furniture, green strip in village centers. Thanks, bye.
Well, I mean, maybe to address both your comments and Councillor Baker's, at the last ZAP meeting, I spent a lot of time talking about the proportion of the width of the public right of way and the height of buildings, and talked about this proportional sweet spot of 1.6 to 1 ratio, and that sense of kind of enclosure is neither too wide nor too narrow, and from the swing seasons through to the summer, I think allows for a nice balance of shade and sun. Now, all of the streets that we're looking at in all the village centers, some run east-west, some run north, Walnut runs north-south, and Lincoln Street runs east-west. So that dynamic of times of the day and when the sun is hitting on the one side of the street or the other is quite dynamic. But I think the kind of the quality of the spaces will, in many cases, even be improved. So, but and then the issue about we've got the 12-foot minimum sidewalk standard in the code now. The question about introducing additional open space into the village centers, I think, is partly a long-term city project to redo the streetscapes in all of the village centers over the next 2 to 1,000 years. Put existing lanes on lane diets so they're a little bit narrower to grab back more pedestrian space, more space for bicycles, better crosswalk configurations, the ability to put more street trees in, and that's a whole. The rules that we're writing are all for private property. The whole other question about the quality of the village centers has to do with what you do with the real estate that you own. And that's a slightly different thing, except for above lots that are above 30,000 square feet. There is an open space requirement, and that's when how you spend that open space should be negotiated and involved all of you. So like the Austin Street project is an example. So that's a great answer to your questions, but hopefully addresses a couple of them.
And you're right to point out the line between public and private. But I will note that Walnut Street runs both north-south and east-west, depending on where you are on it.
Okay, Councilor Bowman.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Perfect. So my question had to do with the conversation about MU4 and concerns that, I heard the thought process of creating this overlay of village center zoning means you expect people would not be then applying for an MU4 rezoning. Do you consider that just in the village center? Or are you really thinking that this is the end of MU4 in the city? And could we, and that's one question before you answer that. I guess we're also saying that nowhere in any village center would we consider there be any case for any building that's taller than 4.5 stories, right? So we're putting at a max at that.
Yeah, that's a good question. MU4 is designed to be used in a village center. The purposes require it to be in a village center. However, that's not defined. So I suppose there could be some areas that we did not include in this, in these village, and how we've defined village centers here, that you may still want to consider a village center, and maybe MU4 is appropriate. I'm thinking the project that was, the one at Walker was not MU4. I don't know of MU4 that's been used outside of the boundaries that we're proposing.
So I would just say that one of the areas that came up is now a village center, and it's in my ward, which is, looking at Langley at Route 9. I mean, it doesn't escape me that we are a block from the tallest buildings in Newton.
I think she's frozen.
They're 16 stories high. Oh, sorry, am I frozen?
Yep, we're back now.
Okay, thank you. So the corner of Jackson and Route 9 was added in as being part of a village center.
Yeah.
And if the tallest building there is 4.5 stories, do know you are one block from the tallest buildings in Newton, right? 16 stories at the towers, 2 buildings. And so I question whether that's the statement of, MU4 being dead is, really the right direction. I mean, I saw really this more that MU4 is what people go to if they were willing to go through the special permit process. I mean, I really feel like just emotionally taking ourselves away from this idea that there would be no use case of a building over 4.5 stories in these areas that we've defined as village centers.
Well,
it seems difficult.
MU4 only gets you to 5 stories.
Right. Okay.
So it's not a big difference there. You have to go business
Point
for
well taken.
go taller than that.
Okay.
And
Point well
the
taken.
business for will still be on the books. So I suppose, we can't prevent anyone from submitting for a rezoning and special permit. So if there were special considerations and someone there was an area that you thought more height made sense, someone could look to rezone it to business 4. And the council could consider that. But, you know, I think for the most part, we're hoping that this is it, at least for a while, if we have new zoning, that the projects we see come in compliant with it. But you're right, on Route 9 is a little bit of a unique spot. And we want to come back and look at the whole corridor there. So all of Route 9, all of Needham Street, all of Washington Street. And that likely necessitates different tools and different zoning.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, just quick. So under the new zoning, by right would be 5 stories, and anything over that would be special permit.
Under the proposal?
4.5.
4.5, and that's it. No additional height by special permit. We are looking, doing some economic analysis on whether there could be bonus height for additional affordable housing.
Right, I know we've talked about that, but right now as it stands, so you're saying 4.5. Yeah, well, those half stories are questionable anyway. All right, that's all.
Okay, anybody else? I just have one quick question. I Googled modern multifamily housing in village centers. And there's a lot of them that use, and I don't know architectural terms, I'm sorry, but they have roof designs where they use this kind of shape at this flat, and then there's this shape.
Right.
And they use it as more as a design than anything else. Is that, would that be legal in our code?
It depends on the pitch of the roof. If the pitch is super shallow, that's called a mansard roof.
Yeah.
And we think at the half story, you have to have more legit pitch, and then the dormers, like our illustration on the next slide. If
Yeah.
you could, Jacqueline, you go to the next.
You see the
Yeah.
building there.
I think that's the steepest roof pitch that we allow. But you're right, the roof pitch is there, and then you don't know it because the building is big, but then it's flat on top of the pitch, because if you got the pitches to meet, they would be 1,000 feet tall. No, so that's the steepest pitch, I think, right, Lauren, that we're permitting?
Our pitch is 14 to 12. You're asking if this illustration shows the steepest one? Yes, this is definitely a 14 to 12.
I definitely didn't answer your question at all, but if you want to
I'll show you the
share with me
picture.
what you Google,
I will.
I'm happy to.
Okay, thank you. I think we've done this one. We can go on to the next one.
Let's do it. Want to tee this up and then
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, so one of the things we've heard as being really critical to the long-term health of many of the village centers is the mix of uses and the ground floor active commercial uses. The challenge we have is the MBTA communities requirements do not allow us to require mixed use. So the way we went about solving that in the first draft was to say in the VC3, which in general is the core of most of the village centers, not all. You get 2.5 stories if you do pure residential and 4.5 stories if you do mixed use. So trying to incentivize mixed use, might get a couple all residential, but overall, I think that's enough of an incentive to really get the ground floor commercial. What we decided to go back and do was take a sort of more nuanced approach to it, because there are some Watertown Street in Nantum's a good example. That's, a really thriving mix of uses there. We're proposing VC2. And it's a little harder with 3.5 stories to really get that incentive, still be able to count things towards MBTA communities. So it's a puzzle we're trying to solve. There's also some areas that we have proposed as VC3 that it's probably less critical that there be ground floor commercial uses. So we went back through and drew lines on the version 1 maps. And these are still the version 1 maps, just with the lines added on top, of where we think at first pass that mix of uses is really a priority, and having that ground floor commercial should be a priority. We can then use the incentive structure and or require a mix of requirements to get there. In some areas like Nonantum, you're outside of our half-mile radius from a transit station, so nothing there counts towards MBTA communities anyway. We may do like the business zones do today and just require ground floor commercial unless it's made by special permit to have residential on the ground floor. The areas near transit stations, we probably want to do more of that incentive balance in order to be counting something towards our unit capacity. So a little complicated, but this is just a different approach. So we would end up with zoning maps that show these mixed-use priority streets. And then the requirements would be a little bit different if you're fronting one of those mixed-use priority streets.
Right, and I think the important way, I'll explain using Newton Center as a case study, how we decided where to put the lines. But I think the other thing to understand is that when we were taking a first pass at this with Jen and Barney, we said, where do we want to require ground floor commercial? And then where are we a little bit agnostic about it if a developer was outside of the black line and still wanted to do it? And that's also part of the logic here. So you all know Newton Center. Here's a map in case we have to refer to it next. You can see that what we've done for the most part is look at where ground floor businesses are today, but also thought about it a little bit like a film set, and said, well, we would want to require it on both sides of walkable streets in an area that in the future would create a kind of center of gravity. The idea would be, and this is just a provisional idea, is that we would require it on the edges of the parcels where there's a black line, but it would be optional anywhere in VC3. So
Or
if you
VC2.
had, excuse me?
Or VC2.
Or VC2. And so if you were a developer and you were developing one of those parcels running down Center Street to Cypress Street, let's say, and you had an idea that you wanted to have ground floor retail, you could do it too, but you just wouldn't have to. Does that make sense? And so we had a debate about how extensive versus how tight we should make the requirement for the future of the village center so that there was coherence there. And so that's what we did.
Okay, first Councilor Wright.
So what incentives are you talking about?
So we're still talking about the difference in height. We need to figure out VC2 still.
So like
Where-
Wobbin.
is the outlier, right? Where it's VC2 in the core of the village center and it's right on a transit station. Most of the other areas that are VC2 are not right on a transit station. We have a little bit here in Newton Center, but not a lot. It's mostly Wobbin. So that we have not nailed down yet. Is it going to be 1.5 versus 3.5? We're not proposing going higher than the max heights we've already discussed. It's just what is the all residential height?
There's also some detail here that we've discussed that I don't think we've committed to paper yet, which is, okay, let's say I have a parcel and one edge of my parcel has that black line on it. So the first question is, how much of the building frontage that I'm developing has to have a commercial space in it? It can't be 100%, but you also need to have the entry to get to the upper floors.
Yeah, I think
So is it
we threw out 75%.
75% of the frontage has to be shop front? And then how deep does it have to be in plan? In some codes that we've been writing, the minimum depth is 30 to 40 feet, maybe 35 feet, so that for 75% of the frontage of the building, you have to have shop fronts and they can't be any shallower than 35 feet. Which means that you can also get units on the ground floor, you can deal with loading docks and things on the back. There's a couple of recipes that we've written for past codes that would define then if one edge of your lot had that black line on it, what the recipe would be. And that in a way is also a design standard. Because you can, you imagine, okay, I get it, 75% of that frontage has to be a shop. 25% can be the lobby of the building. We might set for very small lots a way that we don't create an impossible problem for architects and developers, which is that maybe on lots that are X then X wide, you're not responsible for a shop front because you can only get the lobby to work. And we have to figure all those things out. So, but we think that it's important from an urban design standpoint and a placemaking standpoint that we incentivize as much as possible that we get shop fronts lining those edges.
So you're not requiring it, but you're just.
So we could require it, we've been thinking, because the VC2 is the challenge, right? We think VC3, we think you need a 2-story differential to really incentivize it, because that 1 story is, if you do a 1-story difference between all residential and mixed use, that's really just accounting for that ground floor commercial. So we think you need 2-story difference. That's easier in VC3. VC2 is more of a challenge. So we do 1.5 story of residential and 3.5 of mixed use. Most of the VC2 areas in the cores of village centers where we want to see mixed use are outside of our area we can count for MBTA communities. So there we could just require it. So for a portion of Watertown Street in Onantum, we could just say it's required. To not do it, you need a special permit, which is similar to how the business district acts today. Wobbin's a challenge.
Okay, and if you do make a requirement like Wobbin, then because it's a requirement of commercial, it would not count towards the MBTA communities. Plus, you're supposed to have 5 acres, continuous 5 acres in order a minimum in order to also count towards the MBTA.
15 units per acre, so you have to hit it,
Yeah,
you have to hit the minimum density.
Half of the whole area has to be configured. There's a number of challenges we still need to solve. So it's possible Wobbin isn't really making a big difference towards our ultimate number, and it's easier just to require it for certain portions. These are sort of things that, one, we want to get feedback on where we place these lines, which we don't need to do in detail tonight. We can, you can send us that information if you think we got it wrong. But we also then need to sort of do the iterations of the model, which we've started to do, and see where does the initial MBTA communities model get us. If we make these sort of tweaks, what is the difference? So it's going to be a little back and forth.
Okay, and someone told me that every time you're doing a major change in these maps, that Util is calculating the number of units and stuff that are being part of the MBTA communities.
Yes, we,
I think you're talking, I think
Someone at Util.
no, I think Councilor Crossley said in a meeting yesterday or on Sunday, yesterday.
So yeah, they have started putting things into the model. We're not making major changes to the maps yet, right? So we're getting a baseline with version 1, and we haven't done the maps for version 2 yet.
So do you have a count so far that you put it in the model? I think it would be important for us to see that each time.
Well,
when we're doing different maps.
Yeah, and we haven't done different maps yet. So our plan was for one of the March meetings, possibly the 29th, to go in depth on the model and MBTA communities and have a number for where version 1 gets us, as we start to think about what sort of changes we'll want to make to version 2.
Okay, and I did do some markups where I thought there should be some other ones, and one place where I thought it should be taken out.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Okay.
Just, I mean, to that point, we went back, as we went through each map, and we did this live with the planning staff, we were like back and forth, we were sending it out, we were plugging it in, so any feedback is much appreciated, especially in your district.
Well, there's one, in this example, I noticed that the black line is drawn around what appears to be the triangle parking lot.
Mhm.
And this may anticipate the conversation later about what's a public use district versus what's a building site. And this, I can think of a few things that have absorbed as much conversation about Newton Center as what happens on the triangle.
Right.
Well, it's zoned business today, so it's not actually zoned public use today, the triangle lot. So one of the things we want to do is clean all of that up and have a consistent approach, and that's jumping ahead a couple of topics. But one of the things we want to talk through with this committee, because we heard through our engagement a decent amount of feedback that we should be rezoning those surface parking lots to indicate what they could be in the future. Still have to go through the whole process to get there. Certainly you're not going to be rezoning any buildings owned by the city. But that's a question. And if we're not, we do want to make it consistent. So like you can see the over on Pelham, those, you can't really tell here, but those lots are zoned public use. The triangle is zoned business today. So even just within Newton Center, it's currently
Even today,
inconsistent
right.
in our zoning.
Yes,
So we want to apply a consistent policy to that.
yeah, again, this anticipates a conversation about what should happen there. But the existing use, I don't know how you managed to do this very easily, because I know that you've done it in the maps in the past, but that existing use is open space, in effective parking, open space, not a built environment, it's not a business. And because it's public, that zone doesn't make sense there. I agree. It ought to be the same as Pelham Street, seems to me.
Yeah, so that'll be a future conversation. And if the direction is to apply the public use district to anything owned by the city, certainly it would adjust the mixed use priority lines, because those would no longer make sense.
But then let me go to the other point, which I thought was, you were saying that to the extent you can, you want streets which you want commercial on both sides,
Right.
as I hear you, right?
It just makes for a better environment and more successful retail.
And I think that may be generally true. I'm not sure it's automatically true in some of those more open areas.
Yeah.
And so if there's a kind of a secondary review, it may be that where there's so much distance or enough distance so that the kind of conversation we had last time about the relative street width versus the building height and all of that, there's sort of an analog of that, I suspect, in your conversation.
Well, it's interesting because in West Newton, there's areas where it doesn't really make sense because the road configuration makes it too wide, and there isn't a natural kind of human-centered relationship across the street, and then it doesn't matter.
Yeah, so I guess that's the kind of criteria that the second round would make sense.
I wanted to clarify something that Jen said, because we've touched on it, but we haven't focused on it in detail. There are two kinds of city-owned parcels. There's parking lots, and then there are parcels you own that have schools and libraries and things. And we've been thinking about those, at least conceptually, as two different buckets.
Well, even the new center parking lot, we just finished that out, is now two, and it's green space plus parking lot.
Right.
So
Yeah, and the green space is a separate parcel. And that's own public use. Yeah.
okay, and just the black line went along where the green space looks.
No, it stops before the green space.
It does?
Yeah, yep.
I'm sorry, is there something beyond? I just can't see.
It's hard to see
Oh,
the-
gray, okay, I'm sorry. I just couldn't see that.
Yeah, we have it faded way back here, so the black lines stand out.
I got you.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Okay, now I see it.
All set. Okay, Councilor Laredo.
Thank you, Madam President. Quick question of process, and then I want to follow up on something that Councilor Wright said. Ms. Kyra, could you share with us who's participating in these discussions where you're doing this kind of brainstorming?
This on the mixed use streets?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to understand who are the folks at the table?
It was myself, Barney, Tim Love, Lauren Rapport, and who's Wilder?
I don't think Will was there.
Yeah.
Okay, so it's just so I'm clear, it's the folks from the city planning department and then some folks from UTL?
Correct.
Okay, great. Thank you, that's helpful. I want to understand a little bit better how your proposal for mixed use required will square with the MBTA communities law. And by the way, at first glance, I think it's really good to have certain areas that you want truly being mixed use required to be mixed use and not, allowed to be essentially overtaken by all housing on the first floor. I think it could cut into vibrancy of the village centers. But my understanding of the law is that they have to be contiguous parcels. So how would you get around that in Newton Center, for example?
Like 2.5, 4.5.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if you heard the first part where we talked about how an incentive structure versus requirements.
Well, I mean, I don't see how you can have incentive I'm not persuaded that we want to go incentive structure, okay? The black lines, as I take it, are required mixed use, correct?
So we have written here mixed use required, just to simplify it. The way we've been thinking about it because you're right, the MBTA communities law makes this a challenge. These are some of the cores of our village centers where we're proposing VC3. This could be, a decent number of units towards that total unit capacity. To strike those out completely, just means there's other areas where we have to make up that difference. So we can incentivize mixed use. We have it currently structured so it's a 2-story differential. So we're keeping that same maximum. So here in the VC3 of 4.5 stories if it's mixed use, but allowing 2.5 stories for residential.
And have you run that by the folks at the state to see if that's permissible?
We have.
And they say it is.
Yeah, it is. So we only count the 2.5 stories for those areas. So say, along Center Street here, where we have it proposed as VC3, and we're saying that's a mixed use priority street. For those parcels fronting Center Street there, we would count 2.5 stories of residential towards our total unit capacity. For that, parcel that's one back off of Center Street, that's not fronting on Center Street, we could count the full 4.5 stories.
And so what does that do to the various counts you're making as you're trying to come up with the MBTA Communities Act requirements?
Yeah, we're
it's bound to affect them, right?
It's what?
It's bound to have an impact if you're lowering the height.
Absolutely, yes. So that's one of the reasons so in the first draft, all of VC3 was proposed to be 2.5 stories residential, 4.5 stories mixed use. That's why we're now taking a different approach with the mixed use priority streets, because we think there's some areas that ground floor commercial isn't as vital. Like take Sumner Street here. So we have the parcels along Sumner Street. You already have multi-story residential there in the VC3 area. We could count the full 4.5 stories of residential towards our capacity, but we're trying to balance that ground floor commercial is really important for especially the cores of the village centers. So we're trying to advance our goals for meeting MBTA communities, but not sacrificing the long-term health of the village centers.
So what if a developer comes in and decides that the economics of the 2.5 story are better than the 4.5 story for whatever reason? They just want to go all residential. It's more profitable for them.
And that's certainly a risk. And we could see that. We have done some economic analysis, and we don't think that will be common. So you might get one here or there. The council has waived the ground floor commercial requirement in some business districts already, in some village centers. So we do get some of that mix, and that can still be a healthy village center that, has some pure residential, but still is keeping that sort of density of commercial.
I don't recall, Ms. Kyra, specifically when we waived it, but if you have examples of that at a later date, that would be helpful. I'm just not recalling as we sit here today where we did it, and that might be illustrative of what we would want. I guess, you know, for example, along the Langley Road stretch where it's now all one story or mostly one story across the, from the parking lot, I would really hate to see some developer making the business decision that they could go 2.5 stories and turn it all residential. And again, developers know how to buy multiple parcels of land. So what assurance, if any, do we have that that won't happen?
And I think it's a good point. One thing that I think we should do is run the parcels that touch the black lines that qualify for MBT communities at 2.5 stories, and then take them out and see what the delta is.
Yeah.
And that can be a larger discussion we can have about what the delta is, where we stand between those two numbers and the target that we're looking for. And I think it just becomes part of
I realize you're not going to do it this evening. I do think that would be very helpful because I can see certain areas where if we can do it legally, and because we've still at a contiguous area, that we want to mandate a mixed use, whatever ultimate heights we decide on, rather than allow a developer to come in and buy up a strip and just, you know, make an economic decision that not having any commercial there is a better way to go. And I could see a developer doing that in the right circumstances. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Let me call on Councilor Bowman first and come back to you. Councilor Bowman.
Thank you, Madam President. So in just looking at the black lines, I wanted to reiterate what your criteria was in thinking about where mixed use was required or to be encouraged. So like on Union Street, I'm very interested in the fact that you chose one side of it, but not the T side of it, because I would think that the T side of it would be a great place to continue to have, you know, currently has 2 commercial buildings on that side. One of which is historic, which is the train station, and one is currently a Newton taxi stand, which could be a great place to rebuild with commercial on the ground floor and housing up above. So can you just remind me what it was that you were thinking about in?
Yeah, we actually had the line there first and took it away just because you only have those 2 buildings there. And, you know, I don't see the station building being torn down.
Correct.
Right, so that's going to stay commercial. That's not really a good spot for housing. You know, the taxi stand, maybe that's.
The parcel is too small.
Yeah. Yeah, they're pretty shallow parcels. They'd be difficult to do housing.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I don't know if it makes a big difference one way or the other, because they're likely to be commercial anyway. So, you know, we could put the line there. It's probably not harming anything, other than we count a little bit less of that parcel, but it's such a small parcel.
I'm more concerned about just making sure that it stayed business in that area. I would, you know, it would be great to have it be a more active use than it is today. The taxi stand is not a particularly active commercial use. You know, obviously it does support an important need in the city, but as far as, you know, what makes people want to come to Newton Center and walk down Union Street, that's not something. So if having it be designated mixed use required would just ensure that would be great. If not, if you don't feel like that's necessary, I can understand that as well. Thank you.
Councilor Krinsman.
Thank you, Madam President. First of all, I want to say that I philosophically like this approach in terms of trying to comply with the Green Communities Act, while trying to also, you know, preserve what our village centers are, where the commercial is. And there are competing interests here, right, with trying to create the housing and maintain the commercial. So I think you've done a nice job at coming up with a strategy to tackle those competing interests. my question, suggestion, my question is as you're doing the analysis and trying to figure out how much housing we need, how many of these, again, priority streets or core center streets or mixed use required streets, even though it's really incentivized, we need is to almost prioritize within the village centers, you know, almost like a 1, 2, 3 priority, like which ones do we really need to have and which ones do we not, so that if we had agreement perhaps among the committee or the council about which ones are sort of the most necessary, the priority mixed use required streets or frontages, you can then, you know, do the analysis and see sort of what level you need to go to, how many of those you need to include to try and get us into compliance with the state law, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that Councillor Kritzman, it picks up in a productive way Councillor Laredo's comment that we might have 3 tiers of desire here about these, which is that at all costs, there might be some frontages that have to be commercial. We just take them out of the MBTA communities thing, because we don't want to risk the 2.5 story gambit, right? And there are others where, as Jen was saying, you know, we think the incentive is enough, but it's not a disaster if somebody built a 2.5 story thing. And then there's the rest of the district where it's up to the developer, the development team themselves. And I think that might be a smart way to go here, especially as we get into what the numbers look like through those, I think 2 scenarios we're talking about now.
You all set, Councilor Kritzman?
I am, yeah, thank you.
Councilor Wright?
I would find it helpful if we have have these maps and we go as a group, go through this, you know, what those priorities are. Because, you know, just in Newton Center here, there's some VC2 there, which will be an issue also. While you were talking and you were saying the priority streets, you know, 2.5 for the VC3, which we have now, 2.5 stories, or you get 2 more stories if it's commercial. But then you're saying you're counting 4.5 on, you know, on Sumner Street or whatever, but that's not what VC3 says right now. VC3 doesn't allow you to have 4.5 story commercial. So it sounds like you're gonna have 2 different ones now. So you will have a zoning for the, you know, for the black lines, and then another zoning in VC3, which would allow all housing, the 4.5 stories of housing.
Right, that's not what's there today, but that's what we're proposing.
For the
is
next
that we
version.
could count, yes, up to the 4.5 on some of them and just 2.5 on others. So yeah, it's quite a logistical effort for UTIL in GIS, creating all of these zones, because there is.
So we'll basically have a VC4 then.
I think what you would do in the zoning
Well,
is.
yeah, VC3 prime we're talking about.
I know, but it'd be easier to say VC4.
I think in the zoning, you would say along these street frontages, mixed use is required, and you would essentially list them out fully. And then you would have to then use that and reference the map, and then if this is required, then 4.5 mixed use, 2.5, or I mean, depending on how.
But you were saying, no, you could do 4.5 all residential and count it towards it, but right now what's in proposed.
Right now, you
can't.
Right, in version 1, no, you can't.
Correct.
Right.
We're proposing for version 2, you would be able to.
If you weren't on, if you're part of the Didn't Touch a Black Line, then you could do 4.5, 100% residential.
I think it'd be easier just having another zoning instead of doing the black line and stuff. So, okay, but could we come up with a time that we could all go over these black lines? I think it would be helpful.
I mean, we can, do you want to do it by ward or do you want to do it?
It probably makes more sense to do by ward, but I'm wondering. I think for right now, send us any of your notes for everyone, send us your feedback. And we can do, it may make sense to kind of go through, once we have version 2,
right,
ward by ward, like we did with version 1. And also talk about those mixed use lines.
Because we haven't yet, we good feedback on changing the boundaries of VC3 and VC2. We're still thinking about VC1. And then there's the comments about this. I think we want to get a whole new version mapped. Or we're gonna be chasing our tail or our
Yeah.
lines or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, if you send us things, then we can synthesize, bring it back to the group and say, everyone agrees here, and these are the pinch points, and this is what we should be talking about. I think we could do that synthesis.
Yeah,
before.
we could do both of those things.
Yeah, and I think for version 2, we're gonna wanna do ward by ward meetings again anyway. Those were really helpful to get the feedback from the counselors for that ward last time. And we can, add this in the mix too.
Good, I think we're ready to move on.
Okay, so I did I think I have all the other maps in here, but I don't think. It's same logic, and again. It was a small group of us looking at aerial maps and talking about, again, I think it's useful.
Yeah, if you can stop here for 1 second. One of the challenges we ran into were like really large parcels. So the Star Market parcel was one where we went back and forth because, I think we think it makes sense to have commercial on both sides of Austin Street there.
Running all the way down.
But all the way down to Lowell probably doesn't make sense to require it. So do we split that parcel? So some of these were, we had some back and forth discussion. So those are some of the areas in particular, feedback would be great.
Right.
Just one more question. I briefly went to the Wellesley meeting about the park there. And they said they got permission that housing, even though it's a mile away from an MBTA stop, will count towards their numbers. So they're more than a half mile.
So they're different. Everyone has their own requirements now. So in the first draft of the guidelines, it was 50% had to be in a half mile. There are some communities now that it's 0%. We're 90%. It's based on your land area within a half. It's based on your land area within a half mile of transit. We have so much land area within a half mile of transit with all of the Green Line and commuter rail stops that we have the highest requirement. So Wellesley, I don't think has 90%. So they probably can count a good bit that's more than a half mile from transit. We can count some, but not much. It's only 10%. Yeah.
Interesting.
10% of the land or 10% of the units?
The units. Right?
I don't remember.
Because if we're gonna do higher on Route 9, if we do higher.
Not sure.
I thought it was like, there's like a developable acreage.
Yeah.
Within that, whatever it is, 90% of that, 90% needs to be within that acreage.
Yeah.
Okay, so if we had a higher height on Route 9, then we would get more units there. That would be counting towards MBTA.
If we, you mean for as part of that 10%?
The 10%.
Maybe, and one of the things, this is for a future discussion, is the areas we look to make up the difference, because we don't expect to get there fully with village centers. Parts of Route 9, maybe places we want to look, that we might even be able to get some within a half mile, there's not much, but, so yeah, those corridors are in play where it may make more sense to allow more height. But yeah, it's every community has their own special requirements now.
And when do you expect to have that conversation?
So we expect to really dive into, in March, and then that will lead to sort of what, if any, tweaks do we want to make to village centers? And while that sort of keeps moving, we start to then look at where else do we go to sort of make up this difference.
How about historic preservation?
Sure.
So we go through the maps, Jacqueline.
Yep. Okay, so one of the things we heard quite a bit was historic preservation. And we're going to address this separately for VC1 for the most part, because we really are looking at revamping VC1 to incentivize preservation and conversion of existing structures to multifamily, but to still allow some new construction, because we still run into that MBTA communities requirement where we can only count what's allowed by new construction. We want to also address it overall and for VC2 and VC3. So if you go to the next slide. One of the things we heard a lot was concern about the overlap between local historic districts and the village center zoning. This happens in a portion of Newtonville, mainly some of Foster Street and a little bit of Lowell and a little bit of Walnut Street up above there, and one property in Upper Falls. So given the concerns we heard, we're proposing to just adjust the boundaries in Newtonville and Upper Falls to exclude the properties that are in the local historic district. So they would just keep their current underlying zoning. So that will mainly affect Newtonville. And then the next piece of this is really thinking about how we incentivize adaptive reuse in the VC2 and VC3. So we're thinking about for VC1, we also heard this for, you know, some of the iconic buildings in some of the cores of the village centers. We heard a lot of questions about churches. And one of the things we hear quite a bit now is churches where congregations have dwindled are looking to bring in other uses. They no longer have the Dover protections from zoning because it's no longer a religious use, and all the zoning requirements kick in and it becomes really difficult to reuse those spaces. So to incentivize and make it easier to retain some of the churches, some of the other buildings in the VC2, VC3 areas, we want to provide an adaptive reuse section. And this was just left as reserved in the first draft of the text. So we want to fill this out for the second draft. So some of the things we're thinking is applying this to buildings built before 1940, giving a footprint bonus if you do an addition and it goes beyond that 15,000 square foot, because some of these, there's some space on the lot that you could have a little bit of an addition or new construction, but still complying with setbacks and height. Exempting parking requirements. Many of these sites don't have parking today and take up the whole site and never had parking. But as you change uses, all of the parking requirements kick in and under the existing zoning. Exempting them from open space, same sort of reason. They're often taking up the whole site as it is. And because it's not a lot of new construction, if any, doing site plan review instead of special permit for the sites that are over 30,000 square feet. So there may be other ideas that folks have, but these are just some of the things we are thinking about to try and make it easier and more attractive to retain some of those buildings and reuse them.
Just some qualifications, which is a bit, we're talking, we have a different set of ideas we have for VC1 where the structures are smaller. Because these are VC2 and VC3 districts, these tend to be bigger buildings, churches, pre-war, small apartment buildings, these kinds of things. And so don't imagine a single family house when you think about these rules. The other thing that we've talked about is setting the requirements for additions to these buildings, because these buildings are handsome, that they're not at the frontage. There's some number of feet from the frontage headed to the back. There's a footprint maximum probably for additions, so that we're making sure that the existing structures are foregrounded. So there's additional design standard details that we discussed along with this very rough outline.
Yeah, and these are difficult buildings to reuse today. Like the example I showed here was one in Newton Center that there was a proposal that's no longer able to move forward just because of all of the building code challenges to convert it. So not to mention the zoning challenges there. So there are some things that we can't change within the building code, but there are things we can do in the zoning to make it easier. And allowing for a little bit addition on some of these is mainly to help with you're having to address egress and circulation and things like that.
I think Councilor Baker's first.
So I guess part of would be worth thinking about where are these structures, because there are a bunch of them scattered around the city, but there may be landmark categories. That's a whole issue in itself. But I guess one of the questions, and this shades into the parking conversation, if you're an existing church, for example, the parking demand is counter-cyclical to the commercial uses and a lot of times, and so at least I want to think about whether in fact that's a good idea, even though it's an incentive to not have it require. Is it a good idea in the context because there's no place for those folks to park?
I think our counter argument is if a structure isn't landmarked, then it's at risk of getting torn down where a developer could solve the parking at the ratios. It's a non-landmark preservation strategy. Which is to say, we're not going to require you to have the same on-site parking as a new structure would be required to have.
Right, because the way you solve the parking today for most of these buildings is you either don't do anything, and we have many of these that sit vacant much of the time, or you tear it down. For most of these sites, there is no space for parking. Parking has never existed. The building takes up the whole parcel. If you start to go through the village, the cores of the village centers, the areas where we identified VC2, VC3, a lot of the areas where we show the mixed use priority streets, look at the aerial maps, especially on the assessor's map where you see all the parcel lines. The buildings are taking up most of that footprint in many cases. So there isn't a lot of space. There isn't parking today. So you're not, by putting a parking requirement, it doesn't create the ability to provide parking on site. And that's what we run into today. So for commercial, it should be public parking. And we should make sure we're properly managing the public supply of parking. And because we want people to park once ideally and go to multiple businesses. For residential, it's self-selecting. So you choose to move into a building that doesn't have any parking. And you don't choose to move there if you need a car or you need two vehicles. But there does seem to be a market for that.
Okay, thank you.
And most buildings built before 1940 are pretty nice. Interestingly enough.
It sounds like a zoning performance criteria. Pretty nice.
It doesn't say a lot about zoning requirements. Because most of those were built without.
We've explored the 1940, pre-1940 rules of other municipalities too, because most older buildings that give village centers character are pre-war buildings, right? And so, and it's an easy way, that information built into the GIS data. So what are all the within our VC2s and 3s, we can very easily turn on that color to say, okay, within these, what buildings are earlier than 1940, and very few will pop up and go, oh, I like that building. I wish it doesn't, I hope someone doesn't tear it down.
Councilor Wright.
So in this, let's say in Newton Center and along Langley there's a bunch of one-story buildings, and I think they're older, they're 1940s. Would this allow them to keep the front, build up the back of it up to 4.5 stories and not have any parking?
So no, our proposal is that you keep the structure, not just the facade. And that there can be, and this is what we need to write into the standards.
Small additions.
Small additions that are set back from the front facade, but it wouldn't be just keep the front facade, it's keep the whole building envelope.
Okay, I'm trying to think of any that is small and you keep that, okay, like the Bank of America, so in West Newton. So the building itself is pretty small, it's a pretty big lot. Could they then take up the rest of the lot with building addition to it and not have any parking?
So I don't think so. I think these are the details we need to write in, but I would think we would want the exemption to really just apply to the existing building plus a small addition, not a whole other building.
So when are you gonna have those numbers? And what's a small addition, 10%, 40%, 60%?
This is all what will get written out for version 2. Right. So this is where we want feedback on the general idea, and these questions are good because they help us think through all of those nitty-gritty details that we need to work out. But for
for example, it might be you can have an addition to the building with a footprint that's no bigger than 800 square feet. You know, it might end up being bigger than that, but you can get an elevator and an egress stair in there, but it's not like you can put an addition on this that's a half again as big as that building. That would not be in the spirit of what we're thinking about, especially in our first look at what buildings are going to meet this criteria, which are buildings that have very little open space on the lot. These tend to be mostly infill buildings.
So would you rather, instead of letting a blanket out there, 1940s building, select which ones that could do this?
That's much more challenging legally for enforcement of things.
But just as another piece of the code, and you said this earlier, we allow multiple buildings or want to allow multiple buildings on a lot. And there may be situations where you could have a small building that wants to be saved. It has some significance, but it's on a larger lot. If we reduce certain requirements, it may make it a lot easier for a project to move forward where that building is safe, versus if they have to provide parking, more parking, if they have to do this. It's kind of weighing those two things. I can either save this building, or it's getting too much of a hassle to provide all these things like parking that you say you want. I'm just going to tear it all down and start doing. So I think those are things that are going to come up and have to be weighed.
And just during our discussion tonight in general, it's not what Mr. Lamel said specifically. A lot of this, you're kind of saying, well, I don't think they're going to do this. This is probably not, I'm an engineer and it's black and white. If you don't want it to happen, you don't allow it to happen. You have rules in place and not be wishful thinking type of thing. So, I just feel some of this needs to be fine-tuned a little bit more and make sure we don't get what we don't want. And just with my background as an engineer, the way you design anything, as you're designing it, you're trying to break it in multiple directions. And that's kind of where I'm coming from all the time, is I'm seeing the holes and the loopholes and things like that. So it's something to think about.
No, and that's something, I'm also an engineer and spent 10 years doing development review and on planning side of things, and have worked with many land use attorneys who are finding every loophole you never thought of. So that's the perspective that I come at it from as well. Plus, we have our current planning folks go through and do exactly that, try and break it, because they're every day getting questions about how to interpret things, what you can do. And they're really good with bringing up these sorts of questions as well of, things that the concept is good, but then you've got to figure out the details.
All set? Okay, I'm gonna get to Council Leary and then I'll get to the folks online.
Okay, I was, as you were talking about the Dover Amendment, and that there are religious or former religious institutions that have lost their status as Dover.
It's not that they lose their status, it's that we have a church building.
Yeah.
There's no longer a congregation for that church, or there's a very, very small congregation. And you have this building that's mostly sitting empty, and you need to figure out what to do with it. Oftentimes, the owners of these buildings, who, if they were continuing just religious uses, would have Dover protection, are looking to bring in other things. Commercial uses, daycares,
preschools,
all sorts of things that no longer fall under the Dover protection. Maybe you want a small cafe. We see a lot of times people really trying to creatively find ways to use some of these churches where they just don't have as large of a congregation anymore, if any. And that's where you start to run into a lot of zoning hurdles. You often have building code hurdles too, and those you have to address. But the zoning is something where we can make it a little more flexible for the reuse of these buildings. Once they're no longer predominantly.
I'm just thinking of Newton Corner, where there's two churches that I think of that could be at risk for changing. Right across from the Underwood School, the Presbyterian Church, which I think is on shaky ground, and then on Church Street, there's I don't even know what originally that church was, but there's like three, including, I think, a synagogue in there now and a few other like, really. It's a little sketchier, like in terms of how they're gonna manage, and I'm just thinking what could happen to those buildings, especially the Presbyterian Church, because it actually has a fair amount of open space around it. As like maybe a case study. To look at that, because I think it's complex, you know.
And it is complex, and it's not as simple as just the zoning, like, you know, this example here, the floors are off by a half floor. So to bring everything to current accessibility codes to turn it into housing just became prohibitively expensive. So there's some things we can't solve. What we can do is reduce some of those barriers and allow some more flexibility in the types of uses that can go in there.
Okay, and just your comment about 1940s buildings, I was sort of thinking about that, and one of what strikes me is that was a kind of before we became so car centric. It was really around 1950, and when we started, everything was about the car, about, you know, knocking down buildings to build highways.
Parking lots.
Huge parking lots.
Yep.
And so I think that's what people really like about those buildings, that they are for people and not for cars. And I know we're going to get into the parking discussion, and I was very pleased to see the results of what I, you know, really feel passionately about, that how the parking is such a barrier to everything, a lot of things that we want to do for our village centers.
Absolutely.
Okay, Councillor Crossley, you're still with us.
I am. It's so interesting to be listening mostly. Thank you. I like the direction you're going with this. I think it's a very complex puzzle, and I think it's going to be tough to draft and understand that, you know, the rules we put together are going to have the desired effect. I think a lot of people are speaking to that in different ways. And I'm wondering, well, I'm going to preface this a little bit more. In the 1980s, I worked with a small architectural firm, and all they did was adaptive reuse. And most of the work was turning old churches in the South End and different parts of Boston into congregate housing. None of them would meet today's codes for egress, the size of windows, for fire, for energy, and you mentioned accessibility. So you've mentioned this a couple of times. What I'm wondering about, is there any way we can balance a set of rules, particularly when you're talking about the building footprint bonus for additions, and we don't want to see that from the front view, but any way you can look at the realistic opportunity that by reducing zoning barriers, we'd be able to create something that's feasible. I know that's an impossible question to ask now, but do you think there's some study we should do?
I mean, there's a newer church conversion in the South End on Tremont Street that's very well done, actually, and dealt with all those issues, but I think it's the most expensive condominiums in the South End now because of the cost for there's actually 2 church conversion projects that were done probably in the last 10 years. And just because of the enormous costs to do all the things that you mentioned, it has to aim to the luxury market to justify the seismic upgrades to masonry structures and all the things that you mentioned. But I think, and that all has to do with building code that has nothing to do with Newton's decision-making path at all, and a state building code that, you know, where the thresholds and barriers get higher and higher every year, especially, you know, the stretch code and things. But I think if we can reduce the requirements for parking and open space and allow some leeway for additions, at least there's a path there versus no path at all.
Well, I am a huge affordable housing advocate. But I know how dear some of these buildings are to the character of our village centers. The one you're showing in particular, and there are other, pretty amazing structures. But I don't know if it's possible, once you add in a 15 or 17.5% affordability requirement on a building like this, given the enormous cost. I guess I'd be interested in seeing some kind of a pro forma to make sure we're not going down a rabbit hole that produces nothing. But I mean, I hear you. I like the direction. I think it's really fascinating and and better than landmarking, because there's some clearer standards. That's all. It's just, I just wanted to put some stuff on the table for you to chew on.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you're feeling okay.
No, but that's okay.
Councilor Rado.
Thank you, Madam President. So I just have to comment. I can't remember, was the gentleman from UTL or Ms. Kyra who talked about people knowing what they're getting into when they rent or buy a place without parking. Unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be true for everyone in our city. So there's a caveat emptor, but we have folks who've come in and thought they could park anywhere and found out to their chagrin that they could not. Just point that out as an aside. Regarding the reuse, the picture you show of a historic church, I believe this was a church, is an excellent one for a particular type of building. And I don't think there's anybody here who would disagree with the concept that we want to preserve something like this building. It's worth preserving, and we want to figure out how to create adaptive reuse of those buildings. However, your proposal exempts reuse of all pre-1940 buildings, and that's a far broader category. And I really wonder what you're trying to preserve here. Is it a handful of churches and other similar types of buildings? If so, how many are we actually talking about? Are there other ways, such as landmarking, to preserve some of those buildings? And why would we need to do away with all the special permit requirements for them? Are they big enough, this building, for example, so as to require a special permit under the proposed ordinance? So I think that needs to be thought through. I also don't quite understand how this would fit in with the MBTA Communities Act, and whether you would be able to count, for example, the land that this building is on as part of that or not. And I think that's something we should be thinking about as well, including whether a building like this could be torn down by a developer who says, I really want to put in either mixed use or 2.5-story residential by right, and I don't care about preserving this. So I think the concept is a good one. I personally think it needs more thought and refinement. I would agree with, for a building like this or some others, that you certainly might want to eliminate or perhaps greatly reduce parking requirements. But I think each building in some ways is a separate entity. Some properties will have land for parking, and as Councilor Baker said, a use by a church is almost certainly going to be counter to regular uses of commercial or even residential. So I'm supportive of the concept. I think it's a really good idea to incentivize reuse of historic structures. I think it's appropriate to put waivers in so you can support that. But I really think this needs some more thought. And I would urge you to start off by limiting it to the churches and those types of buildings in the VC2 and VC3 areas, and actually figure out how many of them there are. Are you talking 6 or are you talking 66? I suspect it's somewhere in between, but that also might be helpful in terms of what kinds of rules you draft. if, there's a handful of them, you may draft one way. If you're talking dozens and dozens of buildings, to have a broad rule there, which essentially overrides a bunch of your other rules, I think is a bit problematic. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Madam President.
You want to comment?
Yeah, I think just thinking through the comments, which have been excellent, we might narrow the box of what's eligible here. It might be either churches or buildings that are 3 stories or more. So we're not incentivizing, 1-story buildings with some claim that it's. So I think the stress test discussion we had a couple of minutes ago is an important one. And so I think making the box of the requirements a little bit tighter so that we are talking about maybe 10 or 20 and not a lot, and making sure there's enough that they deserve a rule, but not so many that it's a strange aspect of the zoning code.
Councilor Lucas.
Thank you, President Albright. I want to associate my comments with Councilor Laredo. He made some fine points, especially on this church that we have in front of us right now in Newton Center. I was just looking up the churches in Newtonville, and there's actually 4 that I believe are in, at least 4, that are in the VC zoning in Newtonville, which was quite a surprise to me, but maybe it's just me. I don't think they're great candidates for this, and I don't know exactly when they all were built and if they would be exempt from this, if they were pre-1940 or not. 2 are in the historic district, and you know how I feel about that. 1 abuts literally the Mass Pike, which in my opinion is not a good place to put housing when you are maybe a stone's throw away from I-90. And then the other one is going to be, I presume, to be turned into the new art center. I don't know how this is going to be written in a final draft, but I do like the idea of reusing church buildings and converting them into housing. I think that's a great idea. I mean, especially this one that we have in front of us. But those are just my 2 cents on it. So I look forward to seeing further work on this. That's all.
Sure.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Councilor, did you see the first part of this where we are proposing to remove the properties that are within the local historic district from the boundaries?
I was probably doing some house errands.
Okay, so that was the first half of the historic preservation section, was that we were proposing, it affects Newtonville and 1 parcel in Upper Falls, to adjust the village center boundaries so that they're not including any properties in a local historic district.
Oh. Okay. All right. Well, I'll have to watch the recording then. All right. Thank you for the update. And if I missed anything else that is important, I will, please let me know. Or but thank you, Ms. Kyra.
Can I ask you a question about Foster Street? So if you take it out, and it's no longer BC1, and someone wanted to convert their historic house into a multi-unit building, they wouldn't be allowed to do it?
So probably not under the existing zoning.
Okay, that's kind of too bad, but I see why you'd want to do that. I mean, with the political pressure to do it, but it's too bad that they wouldn't be able to do it if they saw that as a useful way to keep the house.
Well, they could do 2 units now.
They could do 2 units now, yeah.
And they could do an ADU, so they could do 3 units.
That's true, that's true. Good point.
And that's all by right.
Yep.
No special permit.
Councilor Downs?
Yeah, I wanted to note that there are some pre-1940 buildings that we want to preserve that are not churches. I'm thinking of the Strong Building in Woburn, and the building that holds the Biltmore in Upper Falls are both, they sort of anchor the neighborhood. They give it a certain form and shape and are, what people think of when they think of those neighborhoods, but they are not churches. And so we need a way to make them useful and reuse them, but also preserve the look and feel of that neighborhood.
Thanks for bringing that up. Is it too late to start the next topic?
It's up to you. It's a pretty meaty one. It might be better to start fresh next time.
Or when we go through it and then go through it again.
We gave you a presentation and then we.
Yeah, I could.
Present and then.
Yeah.
And then people can ponder it for a month.
Right.
A couple weeks. Yeah.
2 weeks.
So the next topic is one that, I think is when we've talked about a good bit, that there are strong feelings all around on, and that I think is a really critical piece of the zoning and really important piece to get right as we move forward. Parking. So as we did our initial analysis early on the existing zoning and what's working, what doesn't work, what sort of ends up controlling what gets built and the form of things, it's always parking. It's always parking that controls whether it can be built, what it looks like, and has, as we were saying earlier, a lot of what people really love about the village centers are those buildings that were built before we were building to the car, right? We were building for people and not necessarily for cars. We think that's really important to come back to in the village centers. And we have some recent data that I think helps support that as well. You go to the next slide. So we've been talking about this for a while. MAPC did an initial study called Perfect Fit, where they were looking at parking and how much parking is actually being used. They did an additional study focusing more on Newton and some of the Metro West areas, and did overnight parking counts, did surveys of the buildings, building owners, to really figure out how much parking is being used and what is driving the decisions people make, whether to have a car or not. And what they found is we've got a lot of empty space right now, where we have parking that was required to be built, often with waivers. So if you see here, these numbers, the gray, if you look at Newton in the center, the gray is the total parking spaces per unit, averaged across 10 multifamily buildings in Newton, including recent developments like Austin Street and Trio, and older buildings as well. And some that are, further from transit, like the Avalon buildings that were built with 2.5 spaces per unit. And, some of the recent ones where it's been lowered. We're averaging about 1.5 spaces per unit, which is already below our current parking requirement of 2 spaces per unit. That's what's provided. The number of actual vehicles parked is about 0.8 per unit. So half of that, the yellow, half of our existing parking spaces for multifamily buildings is actually being used. What they found is empty spaces, even when whether parking came with the unit, whether it's charged separately, these have available parking. So it's not that they were out of spaces and people couldn't bring their cars and had to figure out something else to do with their car. It's that people are choosing to live here even when there's the option of parking without a car. Austin Street was even lower than the 0.8. I think Trio is around the 0.8. These are expensive spaces to build. Underground can be $50,000 to $100,000 per space. Surface parking is cheaper. That gets factored into the cost of housing. It also is driving how many spaces you need to, how big the building needs to be. It's driving how the building relates to the street. all of these things, and it's encouraging people to drive more when we're looking to do the opposite. For all of our goals for more affordable housing, for climate change, we want fewer people driving or fewer vehicles miles traveled, right? We want to provide more housing. We want it to be as affordable as possible, and we want people driving as little as they need to. And so for some people, that might be not driving at all. For others, it might be commuting to work, but able to do all of their other errands on foot because they're in a walkable area like a village center. Or, you know, for some, they're working from home. You know, Austin Street and Trio, people aren't bringing cars there. We're not sure how they're getting around. They might be taking the commuter rail, they might not, but they're not driving as much, which is the important part. So MAPC did this analysis, you know, across these towns and found pretty much everywhere. Brookline's gotten it close, but pretty much everywhere is overparked. What they found, so they did a statistical analysis of all of this to try and figure out where there's correlation and what factors are maybe most impacting the numbers of vehicles per unit. And they looked at proximity to transit, they looked at access to jobs, density of jobs that can be reached within 45 minutes on transit. They looked at income levels, they looked at you know, the cost of housing, all of these things. And what they found was the most dominant factor was parking supplied. So where parking is supplied, there more people have vehicles. That influence things more so than proximity to transit, whether it's affordable unit or market rate, all of those things. And what they found was each additional space per unit is associated with an increase of 0.24 parked cars per household. So what they're recommending, which is—
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Can you just clarify that before you get to the recommendation? I'm trying to read the chart and not quite understanding it. So if you don't bear with me, just a minute.
Yeah, and there's more information. So I put the whole presentation from MAPC in the packet.
No, I've seen that,
Okay.
but that's why I'm still puzzled because of the bar chart. I still don't quite understand.
Oh, the bar chart?
Yeah.
Sure. So the gray bar is the
Requirement.
no, not the requirement, the existing parking. So parking spaces per unit that are provided on site. So for Newton, it averages about 1.5.
Okay.
So for
that's what's required to be there, or
that's what's there. That's what exists.
no, maybe not required, but just saying that the unit has associated with it 1.5
On average across.
On average. So
Okay.
taking the total number of parking spaces that are provided and the total number of units.
Okay,
You get to
so
about
that's not
1.5.
necessarily a requirement, that's just a.
That's what was provided.
Provided,
Yes,
okay,
which is actually lower than our requirement.
okay, that's helpful, then,
What's actually being used in Newton comes out to an average of 0.8 spaces per unit. So
you went through that quickly, but let me just ask again, sorry.
yeah,
When you say used means. at
there's
any
actually a
time,
car parked there.
But, you know, I mean, a car could be there for an hour and then go somewhere else. Does it count, or does it mean that it has to be there all the time? That's just-
No, the counts were done overnight. So they're done at like midnight, 1 a.m. On time outside of typical holidays to see how many cars are parked there. So there, you know, of course, could be some people who are away on vacation, but you don't get a big difference there. They also did surveys. So some of the properties know because they lease the spaces separately. So they actually know how many are leased. So between the overnight counts and the surveys is how they get this number.
Okay, so
Yeah.
this is.
And this is just residential. This isn't commercial. So you don't have people coming and going, like the public using it.
But you're operating the assumption that if you're in the unit and you have a car, the car is going to be there when you're asleep. right?
Yes.
Okay, that's just.
Yes.
what I'm trying to-
Could we get the raw data, like the data it was and the apartment complexes that they use? Because it'd be interesting is, you know, things that were built just in the last 3 years versus, you know, the Avalon's, you know, like you said, was over.
The Avalons, yeah, and so we have the presentation. We have some raw data but MAPC hasn't released it yet. So I need to check with them if that's something. that-
Because I
And the
read,
report's coming out soon. It was supposed to be out the end of last year.
so
But the Avalon is about, I want to say those are just over one space per unit is actually being utilized.
what I was surprised that the original, the original results, the first time, Woodland, which is literally on the T-stop, was like 1.6 or something like that, was really high, which I was very surprised at.
And I think it's Woodland's come down now. One of the other interesting factors is whether a space comes with the unit or not. And Woodland, I believe one space comes with the unit. Austin Street and Trio are charging per space.
But, and then the thing
But
with,
before, I'm sorry, just can you finish out what the yellow
Okay.
chart is?
Oh,
I really
sure.
didn't understand the chart.
The yellow is the number of vehicles per total spaces. So half of our spaces are occupied.
It's really a percentage.
Yeah, it's a percentage. So 50%, it's basically
Oh, I
the
see.
40
That's the
out of
translation
45.
of the grade.
It's a difference between the grade.
Sorry, that's what I was trying to
Yeah.
figure out.
It's
Yeah.
unintuitive in the graphic.
It's not.
But MAPC did it.
Yeah, it wasn't us.
And you looked off at the 0.24 and you were.
Yeah, so based on their statistical analysis, they found each additional space, and this is across the region, this isn't specific to Newton, but this is what they found across. Each additional parking space that is provided on site is associated with an increase of 0.24 parked cars per household. So essentially, if you build it, they will park there. And that was the presence of parking had more of an effect than proximity to transit, income levels, those sorts of things. So what MAPC is recommending, and this is consistent with best practices across the country in the direction many communities are going, is to reduce or eliminate parking minimums, apply parking maximums, decouple parking and housing. And this is something that I think we do successfully today, is require that the parking be leased or sold separate from the unit. That allows each person to make their own decisions about whether or not they need parking, and helps with the cost of the unit. And to really bring down those ratios, particularly in proximity to transit, and ideally go to 0 minimum and a maximum. So what we're proposing, if you want to go to the next slide. If you remember correctly, our first version, we went with 1 space per unit across the board in residential. And, you know, there was, I think some on the, you know, the conversations we had some comfort with that, some strong push to go to 0 or further, and some concern that is that enough. So based on the data we've seen, we think 1 is certainly too high. It's higher than the actual rate we're seeing today. And we have an opportunity to push that even further down. And in particular, in our village centers, where these are walkable areas, you've got a mix of uses. You often have, you know, transit there. That's where we really want to see people living and not needing a car, and ideally not having a car. That reduces congestion, it reduces, you know, our emissions, it reduces cost of housing. So what we're proposing is for residential, 0.5 per unit, unless you're within a quarter mile of a transit station, and then going to no parking required and 1 per unit maximum. And for adaptive reuse, as we already mentioned, no parking requirement.
I think Council Ryan has a clarification question.
So I remember seeing somebody, I don't know who, what council or resident, whatever, saying that, I don't know where they came up with the information that nobody's taken the train across from Trio. So that means everyone's got cars and they're driving their cars. So that's.
And that's not the case. And they might not be taking the train, but honestly, it doesn't matter because they don't have cars.
Sure.
That's what I'm trying to.
And I think it's because they were required to do a transit, where I think this comes from, is they're required to do a transit subsidy. as part of their special permit.
Right, that's. what-
And they came back and said people aren't using it. Very small number of people took them up on it. And that could be a number of things. It could be their employer already covers transit. It could be, you know, they're not taking transit. What matters most is whether they have a vehicle, right? And they're at around 0.8, I want to say, and that's with exit parking there. So more people could have cars there and they're choosing not to. And that's what's most important.
So I want to say about Trio. So I'm in monthly meetings with Scott Lombardi. And we do sometimes for Dunstan East, but we do sometimes talk to about Trio. And they're at 1-to-1 right now. Their capacity, their car capacity it fluctuates month to month.
Yeah.
And they had a lot of people parking on their surface lot and they towed people and stuff. So right now, that 0.8 or 0.78 was the lowest it ever was. And it's always been higher than that. They're at quote full capacity, which is really 93, 95% because you got transition of people and things like that. So if you use the 95% and 140 units, it's 131, I think 131 or 131. And right now they're renting out 130, which is close to 1-to-1.
And they're parked at, I think, 1.25.
Yes, so they're enough, but
they've-
they're not down at 0.8. Yeah, maybe
They
one
have-
at 0.8.
They have been. So when this study was done, they were around there. And I've reached out to Damien on multiple occasions and gotten the update numbers. Same with Scott Oran for Austin Street. And they all do fluctuate.
Yeah.
But they were often at like 0.85. But the parking is there. So I think what we're saying, and someone like Mark Development could choose to build at 1-to-1. We're not, except for in that quarter mile of transit where we want to propose a maximum of 1, they could still build parking. But we want to leave that decision, yes, to the market. And I think it'd be great if even fewer people, like if Trio had fewer parking spaces, there'd be fewer people living there, you know, with cars. And, you know, hopefully more people taking transit or working from home or walking and, you know, fewer cars on the road, which is, I think, everyone's goal is to, how do we allow for more housing, but reduce the cost of that housing and not contribute significantly to traffic.
Councillor Krinsman.
Thank you, Madam President. I think we said we weren't going to discuss this. We were just going to hear the presentation, so I'll be extremely brief. Very pleased to see this progression in the philosophy. It's why I argued for reduced parking at Riverside when Riverside was being proposed. I would suggest that the data you just presented actually argues against the distinction between the residential within a quarter mile of transit. I think what you said was that that's not a determinative factor of whether people have a car or not. So I would argue that there should be no distinction and we should have no parking minimum for the residential. Thanks.
Okay. Councillor Laredo.
Thank you. So I'll start by saying I don't see how you can use the MAPC data whatsoever unless you get the underlying factual data for Newton that they actually relied on.
You have it.
And I'll give you an example. Avalon, which you said is a 2.5 space, which I think we all would agree is probably is too much. We don't use that. By putting that in the queue, which is a very large project, you've skewed all your data citywide. Because your percentage of usage goes way down when you have 2.5 spaces and say at a place like Avalon, you're using 1.25 or less. So I think it's really important to do that. Second, I think Trio is an important illustration and needs to be looked at carefully. I'd be very concerned about telling a developer after we're saying you have to, we're not going to give you any minimums, telling them that you can't have more than 1 parking space per building, per unit, excuse me. They may make a market decision that they're building expensive housing in a 6-unit building and they want 2 parking spaces. So I really think that I don't think that's wise policy on our part to start putting maximums in.
So we are proposing proposing a maximum
Okay,
within a
maximum,
quarter mile
right.
of transit, because we think there you shouldn't be providing
Yeah,
2
yeah.
spaces per unit.
Go ahead, Councilor.
Well,
Leo.
but that's your philosophical decision, but you're not letting the market decide it, which for so much of the other discussion, we're saying is so important. So I think we're trying to have it both ways there. I have to say, if we allow a larger developer in particular to build with no parking, I guarantee that within a year or two, there's going to be a huge clamoring of all the people who suddenly need cars as to where they should park on the street overnight, because they either didn't know that they were going to get no parking, or it's not fair to them because they need cars and we should park on the streets. And so I find this discussion concerning. I'm not suggesting that our parking minimums should be as great as they are now. I think we've made a very good case that they should not be. But to simply say a developer can build a very large complex without providing any parking, and they may have a very good economic reason for doing that, to turn the parking into somebody else's problem. It's just that, it's now somebody else's problem, namely the city. So, you know, we need to think about that. We can't just say the developer comes in, builds all residential, and it's now everyone else's. But again, going back to the real issue here, that if we're going to make any decisions based on facts, we absolutely have to have the underlying data. I'm very surprised MAPC has not provided that data when they provided a report. I would think that would be a given to do an analysis. So
yeah, the report isn't out yet, and where it should be out any time now, and we've been waiting for it. It's supposed to be out the end of last year. It keeps getting pushed back. We asked them for this presentation that they gave recently to the Metro West Home Consortium, and we asked them for the raw data because we're right in the midst of this work, and it would be a shame for the report to come out afterwards that really could have informed this work.
And
so
why did they refuse to produce the raw data?
we have the raw data. That's what I'm saying. I need to verify with MAPC that we can make that public. So we have the raw data, we've reviewed the raw data, but they have not published the raw data. So that's where I need to check with MAPC when the report will be out and whether that raw data can be made public. One of the things, if you go back a slide, Jacqueline, I just want to clarify is, you're right, basically the gray and the yellow bars get skewed because we have things that are all over the map. The important piece is that blue one, right? So the gray and the yellow is just showing you've got a lot of unused parking sitting there. We've had requirements for projects to build parking that isn't being used. What's really informative, I think, is the blue, and that doesn't get skewed because Avalon is parked at 2.5 spaces per unit, and Trio's at 1.25. The blue is how many cars are actually there, how many cars are parking there per unit, and that's influenced by the amount of parking. But that's the utilization rate, which is, I think, more important than the other numbers.
Looking at that chart, Ms. Kyra, you have two communities, Concord and Sudbury, which have relatively little transit comparatively. Concord is a train. I don't recall what Sudbury has. Watertown, though, which has a fair amount of transit, at least in terms of bus lines, seems to have more parking than we do. And Watertown, like Newton, is a fairly densely built city. So I just wonder about the utilization here and what exactly you're looking at, because I suspect the location of the various developments would make a big difference in terms of the utilization rates. I mean, if you look at Trio, for example, it looks like Trio is mostly full. You're never going to get 100% capacity.
It's not full because they're at I think they're parked at, they were required to have like 1.25. And it seems like they've been going between like 0.8 and 1 per unit.
And what would you consider capacity at that level?
It's usually 85%. If you typically, Well, if you're counting, if you're counting in the evening at the midnight, 1 PM, or the way that Mark Development is probably counting it, capacity is how many spaces are being used when they do the surveys. And so if they built 1.25 and they're at the max parking at 1, then they overbuilt the parking.
Well, but you're never gonna get every single space used. And number one, number two, you're bound to have some turnover. That's gonna limit, I mean, somebody's moving out, moving in, so again, I don't wanna belabor it. I really think before we draw any conclusions from this data that we're going to use to set public policy village-wide, that we need to understand the underlying information that we're getting so we can better analyze it. And I'll leave it at that. I'm not suggesting we don't reduce our parking numbers. I would be very concerned about not having any requirements at all and just expecting that folks are magically either not going to have cars at all to a large degree, or somehow magically going to find parking elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to go to Council Leary here in the room.
Okay, thank you, Madam President. Oh, no discussion.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is such a fascinating topic.
Do you have clarification or what?
I did have a clarification. One of them was so going back to where the data that this came from, how many of these studies had the unbundled parking from the housing?
So I don't know offhand, but we do have that information, and that is a factor. Again, MAPC did full statistical analysis of all of this, and they found the dominant factor was the presence of parking. And they looked at unbundled, income levels, proximity to transit, all of these things. And the dominant factor was presence of parking. I believe the unbundled plays a role, and one of the recommendations is to unbundle.
And then there have been similar studies in other communities, other states. That I think some of the what you're finding here has been similar. I mean, I'm certainly not shocked by this, even if it's Councilor Laredo been concerned about the data, and as you know, data can sometimes be skewed, and that's something to look at. But overall, this is what we're seeing in other states and other communities who've studied this over the last several years.
The trend is definitely towards removing or greatly reducing parking.
Yeah, and the more parking you offer, especially for free, the more people bring their cars. And if anyone's been driving down Route 20 in Sudbury during any kind of peak hour, I know people that live there, they have to plan their day if they're going to use their car about how they're going to get there and at what time. There is transit in Sudbury. There is, the train goes through there, but I don't think it's convenient to everybody. But I just think that that we, you see those kinds of the more parking that you do offer, you will see more people driving. The other thing, I think there has to be a distinction between multifamily versus 1 and 2 family homes, specifically because for most people in like, there's situations right now who have condos and they want to bring an extra car. So we're talking of, I think that's
and
a
this
different
wouldn't
issue.
apply to 1 and
This
2
would-
family.
Right, it wouldn't apply. And I think with multifamilies, especially when they're in village centers or near transit, you have a different population that's attracted to that.
Okay, Councilor Lucas, it's for clarification, right?
Clarification,
Yes.
not discussion?
No, we have a lot of people who want to go home, I guess, in this room.
But I'm already home. All right, can I just have like 1 minute?
Yeah, 1 minute.
All right, can you go to the prior slide, please? Okay, the other prior slide. I think you had it right with version 1.0 mostly. I like the 1-to-1, that's just me. It allows anyone who wants to purchase a car to be able to purchase a car, even if they move into the apartment complex and they don't have one. when they first move in, and then things change and they need to purchase a car. It allows them to do that. Also allows for guest parking in a place like Trio or 28 Austin Street. And with the last column, adaptive reuse, it says 1 per unit. I think that's the one where I would not have a requirement. And I think we need more data just in general on the parking studies that were in the packet. Mainly, were these studies done pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, or during the pandemic? I mean, I don't think it said it in the packet. So I'll leave it at that because I know folks want to go home. So.
Thank you, Councilor Lucas.
Okay.
Councilor Bowman, also clarification, right?
I'll be very quick. I'm just going to remind everyone that it's not just one of the things that can really help you live car light or car free is being close to amenities. So I think that's one of the reasons why people in Newtonville, even if they're not taking, say, the commuter rail into work or otherwise, the fact that they have grocery stores and coffee shops and restaurants that they can go to, you know, somehow it's easier to even think about like, okay, I can bike to work or take the bus to work, but if I have to come home and take the bus to go to the grocery store, that seems harder. And I might feel like I need to own a car for that. So I do think that it makes a lot of sense in our village centers where people will have access to these other trips much more conveniently. I think it's a lot easier for people to think about owning fewer vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just real quick. I have a lot more questions. I'll do it at another time. But I was at the meeting when they presented it, and at Avalon and Chestnut Hill, and one of the parking spots was a Zamboni.
Zamboni?
A Zamboni.
Yeah, they found all sorts of fun things.
And they had patio furniture in another parking spot and people taking 2 spots, angled parking.
Yeah, we have some fun pictures. It was a lot of our staff that went out and did some of those counts and found lots of fun.
Using for storage.
Yeah.
You know, and all I can think of is that scene from Casablanca where he says, shock, working, you know.
All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Madam President, I'm happy to move hold if you'd like. And by the way, I support Zamboni parking, but I'll move hold.
Favor of vote, say aye.
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 Opposed, no. Oh, okay, good. We're all done. Thank you. Great discussion.
I enjoyed this.